I have a confession to make. I thought that Divinity Original Sin 2 was going to be the biggest game that Larian ever made. I thought it would be their biggest seller. I never thought they'd release anything as successful as that game. But I was totally wrong. Baldur's Gate 3 has been a juggernaut. It has been humongous, not just in terms of mainstream attention, but in terms of sales. There have been people coming into this ecosystem, you could call it, coming into the CRPG space, who previously had no interest in role-playing games at all, let alone computer RPGs, that more hardcore, I suppose you could call it, subgenre. There are people who've been absolutely all over it, and the train's not really stopping. There's still heaps and heaps of people on Steam playing Baldur's Gate 3. It's been nothing short of a complete success. If you look at my personal list of top 3 achievements in my life, you will find beating Divinity Original Sin 2 on Tactician difficulty, one of the hardest difficulties to be fair, at the top of that list. I was very happy, I was very fulfilled in beating that game, but I did think that it was going to be the peak for Larian. I really didn't think that afterwards they would achieve that level of success again, because it just felt like everything lined up for them. They had all the players from the original Sin, the original Sin release, actually come and play the new game. Everyone was excited for it. You then had people who got, I suppose, excited about the reviews. They saw all these great Metacritic scores, 95 plus was it? It was very, very high. So you had people coming in for that reason, and then word of mouth. But what I thought was going to happen is that a lot of people excited for Original Sin 2 were people who never really played a CRPG before. I figured they'd seen the reviews, they'd heard, hey, this great new RPG is releasing, and they went ahead and played it. And their prior experience might have been Skyrim, it might have been Mass Effect. Other, I suppose, console RPGs, The Witcher 3, not really CRPGs, where it is different. You're controlling a party. It's isometric. And I figured that was going to turn a lot of people off, because I did see comments online quite often where people would say, hey, I did try out the game, it looked really good, it seems to function quite well, but it just didn't do it for me. It's not my style of game. It feels a bit too niche. And while that's a bit disappointing, it's also just what you would expect in the mainstream. Isometric games, sadly, are not going to appeal to everyone, and I thought that would basically be it. Larian would release new games, they wouldn't quite hit the sales of something like a Divinity Original Sin 2, because that game really popped off. A lot of people got into it. It was high quality, but that doesn't always guarantee success. If you look at Obsidian, they released Pillars of Eternity 2. It basically bombed. It didn't do very well, and often more and more sequels means less sales unless you're an absolutely mainstream success series like a Pokemon or a Grand Theft Auto, where you just keep bringing people in. For a lot of series, there is a limit. Not the case for Larian, though, because Baldur's Gate 3 has come out, and the sales figures are starting to get out there, and we're seeing information such as 21 plus million copies of Baldur's Gate 3 have been sold on Steam. This is according to Steam Spy stats, so they're not official numbers released by Larian, but I would say that it's fair to sort of cover that there's at least 20 million copies of this game that have sold. And that is just on Steam. We're not talking about PS5 yet, potentially Xbox. It is purely Steam. I bought the game on GOG. So I didn't even buy it on Steam. I'm not contributing to these numbers. And I think if there's anyone who's going to buy a game on GOG, it's going to be a fan of a CRPG. That's where a lot of them are, and they run quite well if you buy them from that website. So I think it's fair to maybe even add 1 or 2 million more sales to that. And if you factor in PS5, again, Xbox is coming later, getting to 25 million copies sold is a realistic number. It sounds accurate. It's not an absolute assumption. It's not coping from people who are desperate for this series, for CRPGs to be a success. It sounds like 25 million copies of this game have sold, and that is even bigger than I would have ever expected. I knew the game had done well, But I thought that that might have just been echo chambers, communities of people who come together who love games that aren't service-based, they're not filled with microtransactions, loot boxes, they're not always online, although there are good elements of Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of the multiplayer. I'm sure you get what I mean. But gamers had had enough. They were sick of games being developed by committee, executives in a boardroom using purely analytics, spreadsheets, PowerPoints, using all those metrics to craft a product that could extract as much money from customers as possible. People have been sick of it. They want games that are made by gamers for gamers. That passion, actually taking the experiences of past innovative games, expanding on them, and pushing this medium forward. That is something that Baldur's Gate 3 does. Its systems, its presentation, everything about it is phenomenal, and gamers have rewarded the developers for it. This game has sold exceptionally well. If we look at other games that have reached that 25 million mark, this list may or may not be completely accurate, but it's a fair representation of games that have sold a lot of copies. And you've got very mainstream games here. You've got the Pokemon series. You've got Grand Theft Auto. If we think of something comparable to a Baldur's Gate 3, there is Cyberpunk 2077. That game was absolutely massive when it came out. Some may forget, but in 2020, when it was that hype train, it was coming up for release, everyone was talking about it. It wasn't just RPG fans, it wasn't just purely Cyberpunk or CD Projekt Red fans, RPG fans. It was really getting into the mainstream, and when it came out, bombs essentially went off because the controversies around the release, they went everywhere. Sony even took it off the store. Do you think that they would have done that for your average indie game that didn't perform too well? Absolutely not. That was a huge, huge moment. That game sort of captured everyone's attention, and that sold 25 million copies. Baldur's Gate 3, that I don't think anyone would have guessed would have achieved even half that number, has managed to do it, it looks like. If those numbers on Steam Spy are accurate, it's looking like 25 plus million, and it's a game that's going to have a lot of legs. If we go up and look at some of the really top selling ones, we're getting into the 50 million plus territory here. You've got Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, 50 million copies. I didn't actually know that. That is a humongous number for a single player game that's released. I suppose 8 years ago now, it's been a while, but I still didn't think it'd be essentially in the top 10. That's pretty huge. I could see Baldur's Gate 3 getting pretty close one day, because it just seems like people have not stopped playing it. Doesn't matter if Starfield comes out, people might, yeah, I'll take a quick break for Starfield, quickly realize it's not of the same quality, go back to Baldur's Gate 3, and it's been similar with other games. I don't think anything's going to distract people. It's not one of those games that had a huge hype train, people jumped on it, then jumped straight off it when the next fad came around. People genuinely bought it because it was quality. Because people were saying, hey, do you want a fun experience that's going to have depth, it's going to engage you? This is it. That was the Baldur's Gate 3 appeal, and it has delivered. It continues to deliver. People talk about, well, what are the flaws? Maybe the last third of the game. That is fixable, though. It's something Larian seems to be working on quite heavily. Once they do that, I don't think there's really going to be anything you can say negatively about the game, which is quite phenomenal. Short little things here and there, but if we talk about just games that are consistent, that do deliver in most areas, combat, characters, exploration, presentation, and when we talk about that, it's graphics, voice acting, everything else, polish. It delivers on all those areas. It may not be everyone's favourite game ever, but I think most people are going to say 2023, Baldur's Gate 3 was one of the best RPGs released. I don't think that's going to not be the case for just about anyone. So it is very special. It is a special moment. I think it's something we have to appreciate, because the RPG genre, it has been in trouble many, many times before. Some may not remember the dark times, I suppose. This was a period when PC gaming was probably at its lowest ebb. You're talking sort of the late 2000s, early 2010s. Not a lot was coming out on PC, and when it did, it was often purely PC-centric games. The mainstream was on console, everyone else was on PC, but things have changed. Things have very much changed. We heard recently Capcom talk about how even an action series, if you want to call it survival horror, Resident Evil, probably has most of its players on PC. Baldur's Gate 3, 25 million copies sold potentially and going up. Most of those players on PC. So this is a massive market, and it means developers are going to make games with that PC audience in mind. It's not going to be purely games that are perfect on controller first, and then anything on PC with a mouse is going to play second fiddle. I think those times may be coming to an end. There's always going to be those absolute mainstream phenomenons like Grand Theft Auto, like FIFA, all of those sort of typical games that sometimes we consider non-gamers games, where there are people who pick up those titles just for that. They're not looking up and checking out gaming news and buying whatever comes out this month, Lords of the Fallen. What was the previous month? Starfield, Lies of P, or that sort of release schedule. There's tons of people who do not care. They pick up maybe a FIFA and a COD once a year, and that is all they play. Those people, sure, console is going to be for them and will continue to do well, but I do think that PC is a genuine force now, and developers will have to recognize it. They will have to make games for PC, for the computer. So I do think Larian deserves a lot of praise. We've had some pathetic comments go out about how, developers are feeling a bit threatened by how Larian have released such a great game, and it's impossible for other studios to do it. That is just nonsense. Any point I've heard about that is garbage. For instance, the early access argument that, because Larian released Baldur's Gate 3 in early access, it allowed them to gather so much feedback, improve the game. No one else is able to do that. I don't believe that for a second, because I bought Baldur's Gate 3 day one on early access, and I played it through from start to finish. I put it down, I never touched it again until it released officially this year. And you know what? Act 1, from the early access, going into full release, it was not drastically different. Sure, a lot of improvements had been made, that's to be expected, but the fundamental experience, at least for me, was the same. So I don't want to hear that the early access was the only reason they could make an incredible game, because that experience was pretty much already there in 2020, and it was great. I enjoyed it. I knew I was playing something that would improve. They were giving me the base, essentially, so they could ethically charge pre-orders, because they're not saying, hey, you're going to get a cool hat or a cool costume in-game if you pre-order. They were saying, if you want to buy it now, here's 30 hours of content. And I think that's fair. I would like to see that more. If you're going to release or charge pre-orders, do it that way. I think that's quite cool. But Larian absolutely did that, and they delivered back then in 2020. So I don't want to hear from devs that that's the only reason they could deliver a high-quality game. That is bullshit. That is simply not true. I hope that Larian can now expand on this, because the interest is so high for RPGs at the moment, and people are going to want more. They've had a few great games this year. If that dies off, people might start to explore other genres' interest, and RPGs could get knocked down a peg. I don't want that to happen. I want to see Larian use this momentum, keep developing good games. And they have talked about wanting to release maybe a smaller experience. Maybe in the next 2-3 years, that could be realistic, that they release a smaller scale game. I'd be fine if it's another Dungeons & Dragons project. You build a new party, you go on a new adventure. That'd be totally fine. The team at Larian have spoken about how it does get harder the higher you level up, the harder it is to create combat encounters and develop adventures of that scale that makes sense. You can't go from destroying dragons to go back to fighting kobolds and goblins in the forest. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think new adventures would be fine. A lot of people love the character creation experience. They don't all just want to use the same party for 300 hours, so that would be cool. People would be happy to buy it. I honestly felt a little bit bad that when Baldur's Gate 3 came out this year, I essentially didn't have to pay anything for it, because I already paid for it 3 years ago. Here it was, I was getting all of this different content. I would have honestly been happy paying full price when I did for 30 hours of content in 2020, because the game was that good then. It was a good experience. So to get the rest of the game, it felt like it was absolutely fair. If anything, I was getting the better deal. So to see that is great. I think people are happy to spend a bit more money on Larian products, given how much we seem to get ripped off by other studios. It kind of evens out. So I hope this is a great start. To see that 25 million, 21 plus million copies being sold, it's only going to go up from here. It's nice for it to be a genuine success story, because when Cyberpunk sold 25 million all the way back then, it felt like they didn't deserve it, that they got away with murder essentially. They released a broken game on a lot of consoles. I did like it on PC, but I don't think it was a 25 million juggernaut deserving game. Something like Baldur's Gate 3 is. CD Projekt Red, they obviously did the good work, they improved Cyberpunk, but that should never be the case. A game should release in a functioning state. Does it have to be perfect? A lot of my favourite games, if you think about New Vegas, Arcanum, Bloodlines 1, they are all unfinished games to some degree. A lot of that was outside of the developer's control, but they were unfinished, they were unpolished gems to some degree, and people still love them. So I don't think polish is the mark of a great game. If the fundamentals are there, it's still going to be good. You can't polish a turd. A good experience fundamentally is what's important. The polish can come later, but it still needs to be a functioning game where it feels like effort has been put into it. So there's a balance. It's got to work. It's got to have some level of polish, but the content is king. That does come first. So I hope we're going to get more from this. We're coming into 2024 soon. There are games that have been announced, but in terms of the mainstream, what have you got? You've got Dragon Age 4. I think everyone has lost confidence in BioWare. That's probably the last game I'm excited about. Sounds like it was a live service that's being, I suppose, molded into a single-player game. Similar to something like Suicide Squad, which does feel like a real half-assed project that they're cobbling together with the skeleton of a live service. And now no one likes them anymore, or they're not a guaranteed money printing machine. So quickly, let's make it single player and try and sucker the people who paid money for Arkham Knight. There's a new trilogy remastered coming. We'll get those same people to buy Suicide Squad. Great! I could see them doing the same thing with Dragon Age 4, so that's not something I'm too excited about. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, something I'm thinking about. It is a game where it's been a long period since the first. Maybe that'll happen. I could see that being pretty good. There is Avowed. Haven't seen a lot. Maybe it'll be okay. The latest gameplay, I think it underwhelms some people, but if they can focus on the systems, the characters, the choices, I'll be okay if the presentation isn't perfect. There were many who thought it would be a Skyrim. It probably is not going to be. It's probably going to be more like the Outer Worlds, or it's going to have hubs instead of being totally open world. Clockwork Revolution, that's another one. Seems a little bit like Arcanum. It's meant to be an RPG. That'd be cool. So there is hopefully some stuff coming, but I'm really excited for what Larian is going to do next. And there's going to be plenty of Baldur's Gate 3 playthroughs before that. There's plenty that I personally haven't seen. I'm sure plenty of others feel the same way. So I'm enjoying it. I am grateful for it. We don't always get positive stories when it comes to games. So something to think about, something to consider. Looking forward to more. But thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.